Now, I would like to introduce the first speaker. Our first speaker is Betty Kale, who was born in Sterbfritz, Germany, in Bavaria. She attended school there and was forced into domestic labor between 1936 and 40. In 1942, she was deported to Estonia, and she was an inmate in 6 labor camps there. From 44 to 45, she was in 2 German concentration camps. Betty Kale earned a credential in child development and has worked with developmentally disabled ever since. Currently, she's working at Sonoma Development Center in Eldridge, where she's a member of the Human Rights Committee. Please help me greet Betty Kale.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the applause. Last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. We also commemorated 50 years since the end of the greatest horrors the world had ever seen, the systematic slaughter of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, the Holocaust. Yes, 50 years after that, last year was the first time I was finally emotionally able to talk of my experiences of the Hitler regime and the Holocaust. Another year has gone by, and many of us survivors have gone to their eternal resting places this past year. A few years from now, there will hardly be anyone left to tell the world of the gruesome 12-year reign of Nazi terror. I hope that this horrendous tragedy will not become a mere half page in history books. Can you hear? True, one forgets lots of tales of what happened over a half a century ago. Yet, so much horror is remembered. I was born and lived until the age of 14 in the small farming village of Sterbfritz in Germany. The village had 1,200 residents, of which about 100 were Jewish. Jews and Gentiles had lived harmoniously side by side for over 300 years in this small town. We lived a comfortable life until Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. Early on in that year, the Nazi brown shirts were sent to our little town to agitate the population of the village against the Jews. Public school teachers, all had been friends of the Jewish families, became vicious anti-Semites. We, the Jewish children, had to sit in classrooms, listen as the teacher preached, Jews are the root of all the evil that had befallen Germany, and that they must be done away with. We were even forced to participate in the most hateful anti-songs like Köpfe rollen, Jews are howling, which means heads are rolling, Jews are crying. Children are easily misled, and they constantly harassed and physically assaulted us. In sewing class, the teacher, a Miss Schade, instigated the girls to stick needles into my body. Teacher, a Mr. Weitling, hung Jewish youngsters by their feet on trees and let them dangle there for the amusement of the others. On another occasion, the same teacher took these children to the public swimming pool and dumped them into the deep end of the water. None of them could swim. When they were finally out of the pool, they were barely alive. My brother was one of those youngsters. Having been subjected to constant stress and aggravation, my father died of a heart attack in May 1935 at the age of 49. Between the years of 1935 and 1940, many Jews were able to emigrate to Germany. I have often been asked why my family remained there. First of all, we did not have the financial means to purchase passage to South America, Shanghai, or any other safe haven. Moreover, the United States Immigration Department had a quota system. Numbers were issued to potentials whose relatives in the United States could fulfill the needed financial guarantees for them to enter the United States. We did have relatives in America who were willing and able to help one of us to reach these shores. My mother decided to let me go first so that I could later possibly help the rest of the family leave Germany. All necessary papers, including paid shipboard passage, were sent by my relatives from the United States to the American consulate in Stuttgart, Germany. My quota number was called, and in early 1940, I went to the American consulate in Stuttgart. I passed the physical examination, and all my immigration papers were in perfect order. I was told and that my entry visa to the United States would soon be forthcoming. However, the United States State Department had a change of heart, and no more Jews were issued visas to this country. Instead of going to the United States, my mother, my sister, and I were later forcefully transported to Estonia. There, my mother and sister were killed. I survived 6 labor camps and 2 concentration camps. I will never forget November the 9th, 1938, the Kristallnacht, known as the Night of the Broken Glass. Synagogues were destroyed, Jewish store windows were smashed, the stores were looted. Private homes were ransacked, and furniture and valuables was carted away. 30,000 Jews were arrested and many, many brutally murdered. The next day, November the 10th, Jews fled their little towns with whatever they could carry of their belongings, seeking shelter in the city. My family, too, had to leave our home. At the time, I was doing forced domestic labor in a home for the aged in Frankfurt. 4 o'clock in the morning, responding to frantic banging on the door, I was shocked beyond belief when I saw my mother and aunt bedraggled and frozen with fright. My uncle was bleeding. He had been beaten beyond recognition. November the 9th, 1938, was thus the beginning of the systematic annihilation of the Jews in Germany. September the 24th, 1942 will always be vivid in my mind. That day, my mother, sister, myself, and hundreds of others were from Frankfurt, Germany. SS men were strutting and cursing as they shoved us into the railroad cars. As we were herded into the train, an unconscious woman with red welt around her neck was brought on a stretcher and loaded onto the train. She had hung herself, but her heart still beating faintly when the Nazis came to pick her up in her apartment. Almost dead, she too could not escape deportation. Nobody, but nobody can tell me that the German people or the world at large did not know of our horrible fate. As this macabre spectacle, railroad depot in Frankfurt unfolded, hundreds of German civilians were standing on an overpass watching it all. On that horrible journey into the unknown, I sat squeezed onto a seat next to a young nursing mother. Her infant was whimpering incessantly until he could whimper no more. Since we had had no food and hardly any water for days, this mother could not feed her child. And he, with many others on that train, died. After many days on this nightmare trip, we arrived in a desolate place called Rasiku, located somewhere north of the town of Tallinn in Estonia. I learned that the peculiar-looking windowless buses they were shoved into were mobile gas chambers. Thus, my mother, my sister, my friends, and community were exterminated by asphyxiation. We, the 100 young women, were brought to a camp called Jägerla. Our sleep, who were the same transport with us, but now dead. Thus, coats, shoes, and whatever they had with them were ready to be shipped back to Germany for German use. We also had to chop down ice-covered trees to make a better access road for the next shipment of Jews. After about 1 month in Jägerla, we were brought to an ancient jail, the city of Tallinn. From that jail, we were escorted every morning by submachine gun-toting guards to our slave labor workplace, the bombed-out harbor of Tallinn. During the winter months, in sub-zero weather, we had to clear debris from the bombed-out buildings and scrape all mortar off the fallen bricks. We also had to carry 100-pound bags of lime and cement to the worksite, all in preparation for our next job. Lime is a very caustic substance, and since we did not have the necessary protective clothing to carry those torn bags, we suffered skin burns constantly. When the weather permitted to mix cement, we were forced to become bricklayers. We spent 2 years in 5 different slave labor camps in Estonia, where we were physically forced to work very hard. We were always hungry, we were cold, and we were terrified. And we felt totally abandoned by the so-called civilized world, who tried to talk to us, Jewish slave laborers, or dared to give us some extra food, did so with the knowledge that if caught, would be executed. However, the great humanitarian spirit of these hardworking Estonian men, who themselves lived on food rations, overcame their fear of being killed. Almost daily, one or the other girls were made aware that a package was hidden under some rubble for us. Without the food these selfless men secretly gave to us, survival in Tallinn was made a little easier. I only wish that somehow these brave men will know how much their great sacrifice helped about 70 young Jewish girls. In the early months of our being in Estonia, babies were born to some of our young women, and the nurses amongst us were forced to deliver these babies and dump them head first into buckets of water. The weak and the sick were periodically picked out from our group and sent to their death, until a boat for our trip across the Baltic Sea became available for us. During this time, the ones unable to continue doing slave labor were slaughtered. Finally, we were herded onto a boat, standing room only. It took 3 days to cross the Baltic. It was 3 days without water and only a slice of bread a day. It was 3 days without any sanitation facilities. Weak, tired, and dirty, we finally arrived in the concentration camp of Stuttgart, Germany. Weak, tired, and dirty, we had to stand roll call for endless hours. Whoever fainted was revived with a bucket of cold water. The following day, we had to totally undress, climb onto a stool, and SS men examined us internally, supposedly looking for valuables. Then our heads and all our body hair was shaved. After 3 weeks in Stutthof, a virtual 500 of us were selected for slave labor in an ammunition factory. Once again, we were shoved onto a train and arrived days later in a labor camp called Neuengamme, which was not far from Hamburg in Germany. After about 7 months in Neuengamme, air raid sirens were heard many times a day. The reverberating gun battles close by, and we knew if we could hold on just a little longer, we would be able to survive and to tell. But once again, the Germans had to torture us some more. This time, they transported us to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The last few miles to this camp, we had to walk. Was too weak to walk, was shot, and was left by the side of the road. Adequate words to describe the condition in Bergen-Belsen simply do not exist. 10,000 dead bodies and thousands of dying people were lying in the walkways, on the feces-covered sleeping planks, and people to the high piles of already lost humanity. I will never forget searching the faces of the dead and the walking skeletons for someone I might have once known. And I still see us survivors, sick with typhus, too weak to walk, trying to help each other get the so-called latrine. 40,000 people were liberated in Bergen-Belsen on April the 15th in 1945. For 28,000 of those, liberation came too late. They died shortly after being freed. Before closing, I would like to add one pertinent fact. Not only Jews were annihilated. I truly believe in teaching the concept Abraham Lincoln proclaimed 130 years ago in his Gettysburg Address. All men are created equal. Teaching this concept in schools and colleges all over the world is perhaps a good way to stop future Holocausts from happening. In that vein,
that Lucille Eichengreen was born in Cecilia Landau in Hamburg, Germany. She attended private school there, and when Hitler came to power, the events that she will talk about will begin. Mrs. Eichengreen survived the Lodz Ghetto, Auschwitz, Neuengamme, and Bergen-Belsen. After the war, she worked as an interpreter for the British Army. She was instrumental in
use it as against which to measure all other horrors the human race has inflicted upon its species since its beginnings. Some refer to it as a second fall of man. I call it man's inhumanity to man. It is now 50 years later, but the past still haunts all of us. Hitler came to power in 1933 when I was 8 years old. From then on, life as we had known it deteriorated from year to year. November 9th, 1938, the night of broken glass, should have been a sign for all of us that our days were numbered. But for many of us, it was not very apparent. Restrictions became more and more severe, and new laws and penalties. We packed whatever we could and gave away the rest to friends and Jewish neighbors. Hardly anyone wanted our leftovers. They knew that their turn would come soon. We were put into a large building and eventually into trains. The trains were sealed from the outside and out a 3-day ride of stops and goes in very hot compartments, which we shared with probably 20 other people. My mother, my little sister, and I came to a desolate place. The doors were opened by the Gestapo and the SS from the outside. And we heard the famous words that kept repeating throughout the war. Rouse, hurry, this is the end of your trip. Your suitcases will come later. The Germans kicked and beat us, and we hurried past them out of the compartments. We waited outside the cars, facing a group of about 30 men in black uniforms, black caps, with an orange band. Like us, they wore a yellow star on their coats. Jewish ghetto police, someone whispered. We had arrived in large Poland. The police lined us up and we began to Although we straggled and complained, there were no wagons or cars for the elderly or the children. Next to Mother walked a young man in a ghetto police uniform. They began talking in Polish, and although I did not understand at the time, I guess that Mother was asking a lot of questions. She sounded relieved, seemingly not aware of the horror of our new situation. I only saw the dilapidated houses, the huts, the filth around us. The shabbily dressed men and women of the ghetto stared at us through dull, unsmiling eyes. The cobblestone streets were in need of repair. The walkways were unpaved, the open sewers were filled with vile-smelling raw sewage. 4 men and 2 women passed us, pulling a heavy, long metal drum as though they were horses, clad in reeking rags. Now the meager rations in the ghetto could not sustain us, and our ever-hungry stomachs could not get accustomed to it. At first, Mother bartered some German marks for more bread and a little margarine, but our marks soon ran out. After that, she began sorting through our clothing, trying to find any item that we could spare to trade for food. It wasn't long before rest necessities. After 6 weeks, we were assigned to various rooms throughout the ghetto, 5 or 8 people to a little room. The room was freezing. There was no coal to feed the empty black iron stove. We wore layer upon layer of clothing to keep warm, but this only provided a nesting areas for colonies of typhus-carrying lice. Threaded cots, 1 to a family, were jammed into the room. My sister and I slept on either side of Mother. Karen, now 11, was terrified of the long, dark nights. She whimpered constantly, scared to death of the bed bugs, which gathered during the day on our filthy ceiling, then dropped during the night, one by one, onto our bedding. They made tiny, plopping, crackling typhus, dysentery, and starvation. We worked in the ghettos. We had factories that supplied furniture, hats, clothing, carpets, straw boots for the German army on the Russian front, but we did not get paid. We got paid with ghetto money, which was worthless. As a reward, the Germans promised food. My sister was one of those children. We found out after the war that they were taken on open trucks to Chelmo, about an hour from the ghetto, and in portable gas vans, the adults and the children alike were gassed. In 1944, the Germans decided to liquidate the ghetto. They brought in cattle cars. I had never heard of it, neither had anybody else on the train. We were separated, men from women, the young ones from the old ones. All this took place in less than 10 or 15 minutes. We had to undress, we were shaven, we were led into showers, and somebody whispered, water or gas. We later on found out what that remark meant. At that point, we didn't know that the dead or those who were killed were burned because they really had no place to put them. Survival at Auschwitz during 1944, when transports came in every single day, was almost impossible. There were selections and selections of the selected ones, and eventually they shipped us out, 500 at a time. And when the cattle cars were opened up, I found myself in the bombed-out harbor of the city of Hamburg, which I had left 4.5 years ago. We were put to work, hard physical labor, cleaning up bomb damage, setting bricks, setting concrete plates, and we received very little food. At that time, I was fortunate enough. We were moved again from the outer harbor to a camp called Saselneuengamme, again for hard physical labor, and from there we were moved again towards the end of the war to Bergen-Belsen, and I too was liberated on April 15th, 1945. I don't want to repeat the conditions, you have heard them. How do we prevent recurrence of another Holocaust? 50 years ago, we tried to rely on the churches, on the clergy, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. The clergy, by and large, were ineffective. For the most part, they lacked courage to either speak out or act. They were never taught to think critically. What we now need is education. We need to learn hope. I would be worthless. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucille. Our PBS documentary, Liberators, is a retired businessman, writer, painter, photographer. He lives with his wife, Sarah, in Boynton Beach, Florida. I may add that his wife was in the partisans. He's the author of another remarkable volume called Glimpses Through the Holocaust and Liberation, published by North Atlantic Books, and which was recently adopted as a reference book in the course taught by
cover. The wounds never turn to scars. I am still haunted by the nightmare of the past. At the age of 11 and a half, the German forces invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. At this very date, I think my life changed completely. But I was rejected for obvious reason. They took cyanide. When I saw the black soldiers for the first time in my life, I never saw before a black guy. They were crying, and I couldn't understand. People wielding steel and arms were crying only on Jews. I have to explain to you in few sentences what was Buchenwald. Buchenwald in one time numbered between 80 to 100,000 inmates. The camp was divided in two entities. One was the big lager, a big camp, mostly involved. You healthy or you dead. There was no other choice. You couldn't be sick in Buchenwald. But I was 16 and a half. I was quite naive to understand the sinister mind of the German Nazis. Whoever applied for help was dealt with the injection of a number of torture. Thousands of inmates were hanged by wire. And their body lifted in a basket, steel basket, hydraulic operated, into the crematorium. In this place, not only Jews were executed by Germans, VIPs, communists. There were people, Ernest Thälmann, the Undersecretary of Communist Party, was executed on August 1944. I went to a hospital which was in a big camp, and I was in a group of 200 inmates. I was the youngest. The doctor who appeared in the door of the hospital looked at us, 200 Muslims, maybe two from the death, and he said, "Today there is no reception." Well, the people just turned their back and they went. Then he said something in German, "Du," and he pointed at me. I remember about 10 inmates darted in this direction that he intends to save one of them. Then he said, "No, do," and he pointed again at me. He looked at me. I was a Muslim man. I was dying with high fever. Well, I had still my blue eyes. I have no hairs. He looked at me and he said, "Are you a Jew?" I think the second was the 1 hour. I couldn't lie to him. I said, "Yes, I am a Jew." Then he said to me, "I happen to dislike Jews for a reason I wouldn't mention to you. But I will try to save your life because there's a striking resemblance to you and my brother. And for this reason, I will intervene with some French chief doctors, and you don't have to mention that you are a Jew, and I will try to save your life." And he did save my life. After the liberation, I tried to look after him. I never found him. I knew later that he went to Poland and that he was collaborating with Germans. And he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. I wish I could at that time to intervene and to help him, to save him from this ordeal of being punished, because he did save my life. I think the most tragic moment in my life was being liberated, when I stood all alone, being a stray dog, an orphan, rejected from family of mankind. I wanted to have parents. I wanted to have a loving master, brothers and sisters, and not to be alone. But I was alone. As I pondered the misery of my life, I was thinking about committing suicide. And this next day I went to Weimar, which is the birthplace of a noble German named Wolfgang Goethe, who wrote about Weltschmerz, the pain of mankind, the pain of humanity. He was not indifferent to suffering of many people. I saw his monument, and in my book there is a bizarre a Latin verse, "Moriturite salutant," the dead are greeting you. In ancient Rome, when the restless went to die on the arena, they are greeting Caesar with this greeting, "Moriturite salutant." When I came to this bridge of Weimar, and I bent over the railing that was murky with rings of oil. And then in a flash of a moment, I decided for life. I decided that I have to live, I have to establish a family, I have to have kids, grandchildren. It was my duty to live a kind existence. I still dream. I am running after the speeding trains. I am stretching my hand to grab their hand. They are not existence. They are elusive. But still I hope that after the generation of Holocaust, which was coming to the end, it could be a matter of 10, maybe 10 years, 15, and this will be the end. Then another one, the last Mohican of Holocaust survivor, will come to you as I am standing before you and will say his final words. Thank you.
I'm going to ask Betty and Lucille to come up.
Just in loud voice, report after my meeting yesterday.
If you have any questions, I'll try to repeat the questions so the rest of the audience hears it, and then you can, whoever you want to address it to. So now's the time.
It'd been a labor camp and a concentration camp. I survived 6 labor camps and 2 concentration camps. In a labor camp, we had to work very hard. And in order for us to put out work, they gave us some food, just enough to just vegetate, but always be hungry. In a concentration camp, sometimes there was not food for days. Sometimes there were no showers. There was no anything. You survived strictly by your own willpower. You wanted to survive. If you didn't have that willpower, you succumbed to the horror around you. You didn't survive. You had to have the will to survive.
Another question? Yes?
Reality for you on a day-to-day basis, how does it still affect your life on a daily level?
That's a very good question, so I'll hand it to the panel. The question is, how does your experience in the Holocaust affect your day-to-day life? So we'll start.
Okay, for 50 years, I tried to bury the Holocaust. I made believe it never happened to me, because if I thought it was somebody on you you wanted to consciously bury the Holocaust, but subconsciously you could not bury it. And I could not talk about it until 50 years after the Holocaust.
I dealt with it somewhat differently. The past never went away, but it did not appear on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis. To raise children, I had a life, a family. You could not live in the past. I have a friend who talks about the past morning, noon, and night, and the children suffered. I decided that my children were not to know about it until they were old enough to go away to college, and then I told them. There are nightmares, especially when I'm under stress. It's the same nightmare, and I wake up screaming, or my husband wakes me up. But I often ask myself, could this have been real? I know I was there. I know I lived it. And yet, reality after 50 years, I went back to Bergen-Belsen last year, reality is very strange. It is almost like a movie or like a scene or a landscape that flashes by while you sit in a train. We all cope differently. There are many people that after 50 years have not managed to live a halfway normal life.
I have to add one thing. When our daughter was born, she was born with a very high fever. It was never determined how she got the fever. She had encephalitis. The fever went up to 100.
To other things, I have an exhibition in paintings in 1960. I am a freelance photographer. So by those things, I think I tried not to think about all this nightmare which affected my life. But deep in my mind, it was always in me. I never could forgive. How could I forget that I have parents, grandparents, brother? How could I forgive what was done to them? They were murdered in cold blood. So it was very hard to come to terms with myself, but I think I was coping in a very rational way with the past and not allowed hatred should overcome my rational feelings and thinking.
Do you see revisionist historians as simply anti-Semites, or can there be any other explanation?
The question is, do you see revisionist historians as simply anti-Semites, or is there another explanation? Do you see the revisionist historians, the historians who deny the Holocaust existed, as anti-Semites, or do they have another reason for doing this?
Yes, and they are for sure anti-Semites. They are ignorant. They could be educated, but they have many educated people today who are totally ignorant. Why it's so hard to believe in an abyssment? And it's a pity that here, in this beautiful country, in this beautiful land, we have plenty of ignorance, plenty of it. 168 people murdered in Oklahoma. This is ignorance. This is hatred. Even, it doesn't have to be only Jews to a Jews. It could be a Gentile to Gentile. This is the crux of the problem. Anti-Semites, if they're all over. This is perennial as grass. For thousands of years, since Crusaders, Inquisition, destruction of temple, the first and the second, Luther in Germany. Everything was imbued, even in North Africa, in 12th century, when most of my...
Deportations, everything is intact. My father was killed in Dachau in 1941, January 31st. The death certificate reads, died of pneumonia in Munich. My father had not ever been to Munich, but Dachau is a couple of kilometers away, and he did not die of pneumonia, he was murdered. So the records are available, even 50 years later. So even the Germans themselves admit that
We have visited Europe in recent years, and we would never get into a discussion with any European about the Holocaust, because we once made the mistake to try to discuss something, and the first thing we heard, wir haben gar nichts davon gewusst.
So I'll let
there are several organizations. They're mainly regional, the survivors of Warsaw, the survivors of Lodz, etc. There is a support system which came into being only a few years ago. There is now available some psychiatric help, which is 50 years too late for many of these people. There are occasional meetings and conventions in Washington, in Israel, in Jerusalem.
So psychologically hurt and who have not recovered, who we don't know about. Yes.
Understood the gentleman to say that at the time of liberation, he felt for mankind, and I wanted to know if he still felt that way after having raised a family.
I missed the key phrasing. After liberation, I see.
And does he still feel that way?
Well, the question is, after you mentioned that after liberation, you felt orphaned from mankind. Do you still feel that way?
No, no, not at all. I feel being now a full member of mankind. I write, I do things, I am creative. I took part in a documentary. I have other projects maybe in the future, which I intend to do. No, I am not, I think I'm a full member of mankind to the full extent. I want to add something, about there was many questions here, but there was no question, how do we cope with starvation? If a day to think, we didn't work on Sunday. There were two groups of youngsters, my friends, colleagues from school. One group, I belong to this group, I'm proud to say it. We are discussing ancient Greece, ancient Rome. We are talking about philosophy. We are testing our mind, testing our days, surge of emotion. So I want to mention one thing, that mind, human mind, still is a potential weapon to deal with human body.
Do you ever think the Holocaust would end?
The question is, did you ever think the Holocaust would end while you were prisoners? That's the implication.
Backing above ground, and we could see the bombs hit. So we lived with the hope that someday we will survive and we will tell the world.
After almost 4 years of starvation, there was very little hope. We were totally closed off from any news from the outside world, from any radio or newspaper. Starvation was so severe, and at that point, you really didn't care whether you would survive or not. You just took each day at a time, and you stopped caring. It stopped mattering of what would happen.
I believed that I will survive, even if I was getting closer and closer to my end. I will quote what a couple years ago. Hope clings to cliffs, to barbed wire, to iron bars, and to human touch.
Yes.
I've seen quite a number of survivors, and they all look wonderful. And I'm thinking, has there been any permanent effect of this extreme deprivation of food upon your life as you live it? I mean, people are in their 70s and 80s, that's a good
The question deals with what is the long-term effect of starvation on people's lives?
Perhaps due to the feathers.
I am fortunate to be in good shape, no sicknesses. I just can mention to you that in Buchenwald in January of 1945, the span of life was between 30 and 45 days. Between 30 and 45 days. Every day, between 200 and 300 inmates were dying.
Yes.
You said that you had taken names and given them to the British Embassy or British government. I was wondering if you ever got a chance to meet the people who had done all the tours.
I didn't quite hear your question. I guess my long after effect is bad ears.
She collected
Mm-hmm.
names and turned them into the British government.
Right.
And I was wondering if she ever got a chance to meet the tormentors, and if she did have that chance.
The question is, you had a chance to turn them in. Did you meet them afterward?
Yes, I requested of the colonel in charge that I could see them behind bars. And the only thing they said to me, I was always so decent, I never did anything wrong, and when I gave pre-trial testimony, I spoke in English. The notes were taken by the British War Crimes Division. The Germans sat in front of me in the first and second row, and I remember very little of these proceedings. I subsequently had to leave for Paris because I received threats from their families against my life. Here to roughly 12 years, all of them were set free earlier. 2 received a sentence of 20 years and 2 a death sentence. The punishment was rather light.
Yes.
This is kind of a general question for all of you. Do you still hold a grudge to the to any of the Nazis or the Germans? Because of what happened?
The question is against the Nazis because of what happened.
We have been in Europe in recent years. The older people that lived during the time when the concentration camps happened, they all had a hand in it, and they will never admit it. A grudge, I don't want anything to do with them, but I can't hold it against the younger people.
It was like, and
didn't do the same as the other SS units. I was in Germany in 1991 to do the film, The Liberators. I met a German student, age 23, 24, who was studying in Boston University. He spoke fluently English, and he was crying.
When you first went in the camp, did you know where you were?
No. Absolutely not. We landed in Estonia. We had no idea what this was all about. We knew this was going to be bad. But we did not know that there were buses that were gas chambers, and we did not know that some of our own people had to dig their own graves and were shot into their own graves. Those things we only learned later as our group just got smaller and smaller.
Working in a German ammunition factory, when selection had been done by night, the German meisters, who were supervisors, they used to go and to pick up faces they didn't like it, and those people were executed on spot. It means not in the factory, but outside. So we knew exactly that people are being killed.
Those of you who are interested. Yes. Okay. Yes.
How was your faith instrumental in giving you the will to survive?
The question is, how was your faith instrumental in giving you the will to survive?
I didn't think of faith. Not at all.
I come from an Orthodox home. From way back, my faith during the war disappeared, and it has yet to return.
There was a kind of faith, there was a kind of hope, because without hope, without faith, we are dead. And I think, to some extent, I am not a believer, but I was thinking about my mother.
The question is, she understands how you felt about Germans your own age, but how did you feel about the American government's attitude and immigration quotas in particular?
The records were only released in recent years, telling us of the attitude of the State Department, the Roosevelt administration, and the curtailment of visas to Jews in Europe. For many years we did not know. We know now, and it leaves a rather disappointed, bitter taste.
Okay. Okay, we'll hold off until
Yeah.
these students leave. And,
Yeah, I'm glad there are a lot of youngsters. I had the experience with the American State Department and the Immigration Department. Papers for me had been sent to Europe, including paid shipboard passage. I went to the consulate. I had a physical examination, and I was told, go home and you will get your visa by mail. I'm still waiting for that visa. The State Department changed their mind, and no more Jews were given visas.
I had an uncle who was deported from Ludwigsburg, Stuttgart, to my town, Częstochowa, because he was a Polish citizen. But he got papers from United States to emigrate. He went to Breslau with his wife and a child. I think child was 4. He was very emotional, and he got a kind of a rash on his hand, and he was disqualified. And he winded up in Treblinka.
yes. Well, I'm sorry, someone there held their hand up and I don't recognize them.
But concerning Hitler or the German soldiers whose faces stay in your mind and embody the evil of Hitler, would you sooner seek revenge and eye for eye on these Hitler-type persons, or would you find the power to forgive them if it's all
The question is, would you seek to who participated in this, or would you forgive them?
Forgiveness is a big word. Revenge, no. I believe that time has punished them, hopefully. But what could I do for revenge?
No forgiveness, just the process of law.
I had high fever. I don't know what was wrong with me. And a few SS men walked into the barracks. And I was kind of chubby at the time because it was not too long after we left home, and all of us had lost our periods. We were not menstruating. We were bloated. So one SS man says to the other, "Wo ist die Dicke?" Where's the heavy one?
The war. He checked it out.
And then I realized that what I did was something unbelievably stupid. I was running to my house. After 20 minutes, my house was surrounded by 60 Hitlerjugend with their commander looking for me. And I knew exactly that I would be handed to Gestapo. Then the German priest came to our house, and he knew our parents, he knew me.
Question is, looking at the world now, do you think that the human species has learned from the Holocaust what it should have learned?
We have learned very little, if at all. If you look at the former Yugoslavia, at Bosnia, they have not learned. And they were occupied by the Germans, and they fought Hitler, and yet they haven't learned. Anywhere around the world, there's an average of about 40 wars going on. Why? For I doubt it.
Mankind has not learned. We hope with intensive teaching, maybe we can enlighten some, but I don't believe Holocausts or genocides will ever stop.
No, because hatred and ignorance prevail, then you might have not Holocaust, but genocide, as we have in Rwanda, or Chad, or Cambodia, or Bosnia, or in other places. People who hate are ready to kill. People who hate are ready to kill. As long as we have hatred.
Or what your view is when confronted by revisionists, to engage them or not to engage. The question about being silent and not speaking to falsehoods lets the falsehoods propagate. Yet speaking to a falsehood almost appears like it acknowledges that there is, in fact,
I've been by a Holocaust denier or revisionist. I will not dignify their statements with a reply. I refer them to the German archives for research.
You cannot dignify their ideas, because if you do, you get into a fight and it gets you nowhere.
isn't that
That was the last question, I hate to say. Okay, thank you all for coming.
Yeah, but you were all. Singing some good goodbyes and some labor.